Muito obrigado, bom dia a todos e a todas. Um prazer, uma honra estar aqui. Apesar de Columbia ter entre as cabeças mais especializadas em termos de tecnologia, eu confesso um certo nervosismo para até ver meus colegas aqui entrar na tela. Alerto e dou uma chance de ajustar seus audiofones se quiserem assistir, que as palestras serão em inglês. Bom, muito obrigado a Débora, seus colegas, ao colhia da Columbia. Eu sou o diretor do Columbia Global Center, um de 8 centros de pesquisa e intercâmbio que a Universidade de Columbia mantém ao redor do mundo. Então, moro no Rio de Janeiro, mas nosso escritório serve o Brasil inteiro na busca de conexões de interesse mútuo entre Columbia e seus parceiros no Brasil. Está comigo no palco, presencialmente, o professor Marcos Troyjo, um professor da nossa Escola de Assuntos Internacionais em Nova York. E agora, na tela, vou passar a falar em inglês para orientar os meus colegas. Paul and Merritt, good morning to you. Thank you for being with us here. I'm not certain you can see the whole group, but we have a large group of very interested people to hear you this morning. We will begin with Professor Merritt Fox. Merritt welcomed the NASDAQ Professor of Law and Economics at the Columbia Law School. Professor Fox is a specialist in U.S. securities markets and securities legislation. He also is very familiar with Brazil and has come here many times to interact with his colleagues about the themes of his research. So Merritt will talk to us first, and he will be discussing the implications of corrupt activities on access to U.S. capital markets. That'll be his particular focus on this theme. In a moment, Professor Paul Lagunes, who's with us there to the left as you look at the screens, will be addressing us on other aspects of corruption. But for now, and mindful of the time constraints that we have, I'm going to turn things over to you, Merritt. I hope you can hear us, and even if you can't see the whole audience. And I'd like to turn over to you, Merritt, for 15 or 20 minutes or so to talk to us now. Thank you and good morning. Thanks again for joining us.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Tom, and thank you to the American Chamber of Commerce of Brazil for inviting me to speak. I'm sorry I can't join you physically today in São Paulo. It's one of my favorites of the great cities of the world, but I can't complain about where I am, which is in the Berkshire Mountains at the height of summer in western Massachusetts. Also one of my favorite places, but quite a contrast from São Paulo. Well, one thing that Brazil and the United States share in common is concern with corporate corruption. Now, while corruption is not erupting as a front page issue in the United States at the moment, the way it is in Brazil, we certainly have had our moments of such eruptions in the not too distant past. And these include the corporate accounting scandals in the early 2000s that brought down some of our largest corporations, including Enron and WorldCom. They include as well the scandals of the 1970s involving illegal cash payments to President Nixon's re-election campaign and what the investigations of that revealed, which were so-called questionable payments by major U.S. corporations to high-level politicians around the world. So it's not terrain that we in the U.S. are unfamiliar with. What I want to talk about today is a particular American way of dealing with corruption through our securities disclosure laws and how these U.S. laws can be helpful for combating corruption in Brazil as well. Specifically, I want to talk about three things. First, how a Brazilian corporation that accesses the U.S. capital markets makes itself vulnerable to U.S. civil damage class actions, as well as civil and criminal enforcement actions by the U.S. government if that corporation makes materially false or misleading statements. So sort of kind of the legal setup. And secondly, talk briefly about how corruption by the officials of such a Brazilian company almost inevitably will lead the company to making the kinds of false and misleading statements that in turn give rise to civil and governmental actions against the company in the U.S. Courts. And then finally, how if a Brazilian corporation does a registered public offering in the United States or lists on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, that can, especially after the Petrobras case, send a credible signal that the Brazilian company is serious about avoiding corruption, because everyone knows at that point the adverse effects on the company if it turns out later that the company, in fact, is associated with corruption. So let me start with the kind of legal setup, how accessing U.S. capital markets can lead to civil or criminal liability for corruption in Brazil. So the first thing you need to understand are the kinds of triggers to civil or criminal liability that can be associated with capital raising in the United States. First, suppose the company does a registered public offering in the United States, as, for example, Petrobras did with very substantial debt offerings. Well, one consequence is the potential for civil damages liability. And the standards are, in some sense, kind of draconian. For the issuer, if the issuer's made a material, false, or misleading statement, it is absolutely liable. The plaintiffs don't have to prove that the company knew that the statement was false, that it intended to defraud people. You make the misstatement, you're liable. And the officers and underwriters of the company are also absolutely liable, but they have available a due diligence defense that they made an effort to figure out the truth, and if they can prove that they made that effort and were unaware that there was a misstatement, something quite difficult for high officers of a company to do. And the measure of damages for a violation of this kind in these big class actions, civil damage class actions, is a very simple. The prima facie measure of damages is just the difference between the price that the security was sold at and the price at the time that the suit is brought. Now, of course, many companies don't engage in public offerings, registered public offerings in the United States, but they list on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. And that also, both doing a public offering or just listing on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, triggers U.S. periodic disclosure obligations. So when you do a public offering, you need to do a disclosure statement, a registration statement. That includes a lot of statements. But the periodic disclosure obligations, of course, mean on a regular basis, quarterly and annually, you need to answer a variety of questions. And if there are false or misleading statements in those disclosures, or for that matter, other statements the company makes, the company is subject to Rule 10b-5, civil damage class action liability. Now, the standards are less draconian. The plaintiffs have to establish that those who made the statements knew they were false. The measure of damages is a little bit different also. It's, in essence, how different is the price from what it would have been if the misstatement hadn't been made. And after the Morrison case, Supreme Court case in 2010 in the United States, the scope of damages is considerably narrower than a public offering situation too, because it's only persons who purchased securities, the securities of the Brazilian corporation in the U.S. market, let's say on the New York Stock Exchange, who have a cause of action. So civil liability risks then are considerably more limited, but still real if you only list on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. But in any case, the SEC can still bring civil actions against you, and the U.S. Justice Department can bring criminal actions. And those are judged by the so-called conduct and effects standard that was thrown out by Morrison for civil actions, but which involves a great deal of extraterritorial reach, but was reintroduced by Congress in the Dodd-Frank Act for government actions for violations of the securities laws. And then finally, as many of you are familiar, another way of accessing the U.S. markets is a Rule 144 offering. Now, that avoids registration type liability with the absolute liability for the issuer. It also avoids Rule 10b-5 civil damages and the big class actions and so on if the purchases occur abroad, if the actual exchange of money for the securities occurs abroad, even if the solicitation for the money occurs in the United States. But still remember, the SEC and Justice Departments can bring actions based on this conduct and effects test. So the bottom line here is a Brazilian company that seeks access to U.S. capital markets can kind of titrate, adjust its degree of legal or liability exposure for making false or misleading statements, but it can't, whatever route it chooses, avoid that altogether. Now, next point I want to make is if a company is corrupt, it almost inevitably leads to misstatements. So just think about Petrobras as an example of one kind of case. We all know the basic allegations that Petrobras officials had an understanding with major contractors that they would overcharge Petrobras, and the contractors would use the extra money they got to fund payments to politicians and in some cases to Petrobras officials. Now, what's the consequence of that in terms of U.S. disclosure? Well, one thing is all the assets of the company then are carried at too high a value, and that makes a material misstatement and therefore a securities disclosure law violation and can give rise to the damages and other actions that I talked about. In addition, these disclosure documents almost inevitably contain various statements of opinion, things like we have good internal controls, or we follow the law, or we have good corporate governance, or whatever. So what's the result? Well, let's take Petrobras again as an example. It's still in litigation, but there have been large settlements involving huge amounts of money with many of the individual plaintiffs already. Now, the more typical case involves a payment by a company to government officials to get a contract or favorable regulatory action or favorable legislation or whatever. Now there, of course, the money is an expenditure of corporate cash. It can't be labeled in the accounts of the company as a bribe, so it's mischaracterized as something else. Again, you've got a false statement and you're off to the races again with the potential for civil actions and government actions. And the arguments here, as I say, when we're talking about these more general statements, would be it's material because it leads investors to value the company as more than it's worth, that the truth is that management lacks integrity or has poor internal controls, or the company is somehow built on a house of cards, so that once it's clear how it's been succeeding through corruption and it can't do that anymore, it may not be able to survive in a fair competitive market. Okay, so far everything I've said sounds like the best thing a Brazilian company can do is to stay away from the US capital markets altogether, or at least limit exposure through something like a Rule 144 offering. Certainly don't do public offerings as Petrobras did. Who needs all that trouble? But if our focus is on controlling corruption, then this idea of avoiding all the trouble really misses a key point. And this key point is that exposure to US securities laws creates a kind of credible signal that a Brazilian company is serious about avoiding corruption, because the adverse effects on the company and its officers, if it turns out later that the company in fact is associated with corruption, is dire. And of course, the greater the exposure, listing on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, or the greatest exposure, doing a public offering, the stronger is that signal. In some sense, we have nothing to fear from these securities laws. And so the basic theme of this conference, as I understand it, relates to how compliance, how avoiding corruption can enhance competitiveness. Well, the bottom line here is sending a signal of the sort that I'm talking about can increase the value of the company's securities in investors' eyes. That lowers the company's cost of capital and enhances its competitiveness in the world market. Okay, so those are my remarks, and I think Tom, we're moving on to Paul at this point.
That's correct. Thank you very, very much, Merritt. That very interesting, and we'll come back to you, Merritt, if time permits, with a few follow-up questions, maybe concerning the longer-term impacts on Brazil's image in global capital markets. I think might be one question of interest, and whether there are lessons for Brazil for the corruption scandals of this magnitude, lessons from other countries. But we'll hold that off perhaps to the discussion period, because now, thanking you, Merritt, I want to turn to the person on our right, Paul Lagunes. I don't know where you are enjoying your summer break, Paul, but in any case, welcome. Thank you very, very much for joining us. Paul represents is a professor of international affairs at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, CIPA in New York, a frequent visitor to Brazil, hopefully will be more frequent, in the foreseeable future. Paul specializes in corruption from a social science point of view. He's a political scientist. So in addition to taking a broad take on corruption, Paul does field experiments with corruption, small-scale corruption, large-scale corruption, to see what the numbers can tell us, what science can do, social science in this case, can do to help us understand the sources of corruption and more effectively procedures, government procedures, corporate procedures to deal with corruption. So Paul, who was, I might add, originally from Mexico, where there have been some, I believe, corruption issues in the past. Paul, you can update us on that if you wish. We'll address this then from his point of view. Welcome to the conference, Paul.
No, thank you very much for the invitation, and good morning to everyone. I'm in New York City right now in my office, and this is where I spent some of the past 4 years researching corruption, but really my career has been 12 years focused on these issues. And as Tom was saying, what I do is conduct field experiments. That's a scientific procedure to get at causality, to understand what causes X, Y, or Z. And so if I may, during the next 15 minutes, what I'd like to share with everyone are 2 of my field experiments, 2 of my studies. And I think both are pertinent to some of the largest corruption scandals the region has seen. So again, I'm not a FCPA expert per se. Instead, my focus is on corruption, especially on the government side and what we can do to control it. But the 2 scandals I would like us to have in mind as I share these 2 studies with everyone. The first one is the one that actually started in Mexico in 2012. Some of you may recall that the New York Times exposed corruption on the part of Walmart, Walmart de Mexico to be more specific. Basically, what the company seemed to be doing, according to this news report, was bribing officials in city after city in order to open its stores, and to do so in a quick way or quicker way than its competitors. And so the reports talked about something like $25 million paid in bribes over the course of 3 years or so. And later, further reports talked about similar corruption happening in other countries in Latin America and in Asia. That's one corruption scandal I'd like to have in mind. The second one is precisely Lava Jato, which Merritt summarized, and everyone in this conference knows probably even better than I do. So that one involves, as you know, corruption in public infrastructure. So we have 2 cases of corruption, one in, well, both in the built environment, so corruption in the built environment and the regulation of that built environment, whether it's buildings conducted by private sector firms or buildings and infrastructure projects conducted on behalf of government. And so corruption in the built environment. And the question I ask myself is, what do we do about this? So vis-a-vis scandals like these, what do governments and societies have at hand to fight that sort of corruption? We know from research and strong empirical research that corruption at the end of the day is harmful to an economy. That's quite established. There were studies in the 1970s that argued that actually corruption was good for an economy, but that's been debunked. We know now corruption is bad for economies. We also know from other research that corruption is bad for government legitimacy, and we also know it from empirically. We know it from experience. We've seen how corruptions crumble or become weakened by corruption. So given the situation, what do we do to confront corruption? One strategy might be transparency. So enhanced transparency, enhanced scrutiny. And that's precisely what I tried to test in one Latin American country. Neither study was conducted in Brazil, but both studies were conducted in Latin American countries. So in this first country, I approached a city government and I asked for their collaboration. I said, may I access your building permits office? And this is the office responsible for giving permits for the construction of hospitals, hotels, office buildings, homes, etc. So I asked for permission to access that office and to study that office. I was granted that permission, and for the course of 13 weeks, I personally visited that government office, and I basically generated per each visit, I would generate 2 groups to study. One is known as a control group. The other one is known as a treatment group. What is in these groups? So in both groups, we have construction permit applications. Again, firms, individuals submitted these applications in the hope of getting permission to build something. So in those two experimental groups, we have these construction permits. Now, they're experimental groups because of randomization. So these permit applications were assigned to one or the other group randomly. And in total, we're talking about, that one had 100 permit applications total. So 50 in treatment, 50 in control. On average, thanks to randomization, thanks to statistics, we see that both groups are similar. So if we picked out any variable like what percent of permit applications were for homes or for apartment buildings, or were in high socioeconomic areas of the city, or were, et cetera, we would find that they're on average similar, thanks to randomization. The key difference between both of them, the systematic difference between the treatment group and the control group, is that those in the treatment group received additional scrutiny. They received my intervention, my monitoring. Those in the control group did receive that monitoring, but the officials didn't know that they were being monitored for those projects. So that's the key difference. These in the treatment group were monitored, and they knew they were being monitored. And going into this study, one would imagine that yes, scrutiny being looked at from an outsider would lead to some changes in their behavior, would lead to maybe more discipline, would lead them to be more careful, would lead them to apply the law more rigorously. And what's interesting in that study is that for the first half of the study, where there was just that additional scrutiny applied by me, they weren't really behaving differently. Officials were not really being more careful. They were not really applying the law more rigorously to the review of these applications. Now, you might say that has something to do with, and I'm not an architect, I'm not an engineer, so they didn't think that I was able to detect irregularities or issues with these permit applications. And that's actually not the case, because week by week, I would share with them the sorts of things that I was finding in my reviews. And I would tell them, look, I'm finding this building here that, according to the law, requires some 40 parking spots, and actually you're just offering 13. Or I would give them several examples week to week. So it's not that I wasn't able to detect irregularities. That's not what led to the lack of an effect from scrutiny. So then I go to the second half of this study. Midway through, I spoke to their boss's boss, so the Minister of Urban Development for that city. I shared some of the findings from this study. He became concerned, and he promised to speak to his officials. And it's at that point that my scrutiny, my monitoring, gained credibility. And that's when they began to behave better. That's when permit applications were actually being scrutinized more heavily. We saw that they were being reviewed more carefully. They were taking 2 days longer to review permit applications after the Secretary's intervention. And as a result of my scrutiny, we also saw that they were detecting more irregularities, and they were rejecting permit applications at a higher rate. Now, some might say that that's not a good thing, but the fact that they took 2 days longer to review these applications is not a good thing. That they were rejecting these applications is also not a good thing, and that they were detecting irregularities is not a good thing, because government is getting in the way of development. Some might say that. I, however, would disagree. I think at the end of the day, science, and I think a lot of us would agree, shows that the rule of law is essential for economic development and economic growth. And here what we see are laws that I studied and are reasonable. And so if you believe that what the law says should be respected, then all I was doing with the help of the Secretary of Urban Development was making sure that the law was being respected. And so when a permit application was rejected as a result of the scrutiny, it's because the law was being applied finally. And you might expect or hope that that would lead to a better urbanization in that city. So the moral of that story is transparency was not enough, scrutiny was not enough to get officials to behave the way they should. What you also needed was leadership from the top. Leadership that's supporting that additional scrutiny, those audits, so that if something is found that's irregular, the officials feel the risk of being punished somehow. And punishment is a key part of this story. And that is something that when Tom was actually asking about my sense about how corruption is being fought in Mexico versus, say, Brazil, I think from following the Brazilian case, I think Brazil is getting the prosecutorial side of things correct. Punishment is important for corruption deterrence. And for that, let me go briefly, I think I have a few more minutes, to discuss that second study I was referencing. And this one is in public infrastructure. So you might criticize the previous study by saying, well, how do you scale that up? How do you turn that into policy when you have a researcher conducting audits? Well, one way you scale that up, one way you make that policy is you involve not Paul Lagunes as a researcher going to cities and monitoring, but instead you involve NGOs, civil society to conduct those audits. But you learn from that previous study in that NGOs and CSOs will not be enough to have an effect. What you also need them to have is support from those with sanction capacity, support from those with the capacity to punish. So in this other country, we again have these two groups. These groups are conformed by district governments with public infrastructure projects, relatively small public infrastructure projects, namely roads, sidewalks, exercise courts, etc. So we have these two groups, and in total we're talking about 200, 100 in each group. The difference between both of them is, yet again, one of them receives an intervention, the treatment group, and the control group does not. And so we have these districts spread across the country. Some of them receive the intervention, some of them do not. Those in the treatment group, what they get is first a letter from the auditing agency saying, or from the CSO, from the civil society organization, NGO, saying, we are going to observe you. We're going to monitor your execution of these public works. Then that letter is followed up by the anti-corruption agency. This is the official agency in that country responsible for prosecuting or for initiating audits and recommending prosecution for corruption. So you have the NGO saying, we're monitoring you, and this authority saying, we're aware of that monitoring, and if something happens, we're going to act. Then the question becomes, well, what's going to happen? You might think of two events. Well, first, let's think about execution time. Some people might warn that these anti-corruption efforts lead to slowing processes down. We actually saw a little bit of that in that other study. And so we might think that in this new setting, public infrastructure projects would be paralyzed. Officials might become fearful and might not proceed, sign things, execute things with sufficient expediency. So you might imagine the situation where the monitoring scheme, the intervention actually slows procedures down. And then the question is also with regards to cost. What would happen to cost? Anything? Maybe the intervention would have no effect on cost. But what if there is corruption and inefficiency in the execution of these public works, and the intervention actually leads them to be more careful, limiting the leakage of funds? Right? We see that this intervention leads to these projects being executed at a lower expense. So that's what I'm exploring in this study. The results are tentative, but let me just share with this distinguished audience what those results point to. First, in terms of execution time, this intervention, this audit, has had no effect in slowing the procedure, the execution rate of these infrastructure projects. So it has had no effect in terms of reducing efficiency. In fact, when it comes to cost, the tentative results suggest that the monitoring scheme reduced the cost of these infrastructure projects by about 50%. That's 50. That's a significant amount. These are suggestive results, tentative, not yet final. But I just want to share with you that this is great news, that altogether, what we're seeing is in the first study, when you make sure that audits have the support they need, they lead officials to be more careful in the review of projects and to ensure that the rule of law is enforced. And in the second study, we find that anti-corruption monitoring actually has no efficiency costs, but instead has efficiency gains, where the country's public treasury has saved significant amount of resources at a minimal cost, which was the cost of the auditing scheme. So in general, that's what I found, and I hope that fits into promoting greater compliance with the anti-corruption laws in Brazil and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Paul.
We have just time for one question, which, if it's okay, Marcos, I'll bring Merritt and Paul back, maybe in that order. First Merritt, then Paul, and then we'll turn it over to Marcos Troyjo for a conclusion and to kind of bring this all home to Brazil, Marcos, if you would, in the concluding couple of minutes of our panel. So we'll switch back, if we could, to Merritt. Merritt, I'm hoping he can hear me. I don't see him here in front of me. Merritt, I was concerned about the longer run impacts on Brazil's image in global capital markets, in U.S. capital markets. Investors have short memories. Is that sort of what you're saying? And if individual companies register properly, disclose accurately, the trauma of this corruption scandal in Brazil will soon fade away as far as those companies are concerned. Or is that sort of what you're saying, or might there be longer term effects? And maybe if you can think of any other country that has faced with this kind of grand corruption that we're dealing with here in Brazil, as opposed to petty corruption, just maybe mention a country that comes to mind that may have dealt successfully or not with these sorts of corruption, this corruption trauma.
Sure. Well, I guess my argument is that there's a silver lining in this crisis. It's not so much Brazil's image has been tarnished that no one would want to invest there from abroad again. I don't, perhaps the corruption would, but this was not exactly a secret. Capital providers in the United States, that there's been, with the Brazilian political system, a great deal of corruption, and that coming from corporate sources. So I guess I feel that really the prosecutions are showing is finally getting serious about this. And the point I wanted to make with the Petrobras case is that and Brazilian corporations can see there are really serious consequences for their bottom line if they do access U.S. capital markets. You know, bonding there is companies that then choose to do so are themselves or bonding themselves to in a conscious way to being less corrupt, because they can see that if they are, serious consequences will happen. So the decision to access the capital markets is a commitment to be cleaner.
Thank you very much, Merritt. And please stay with us. So we wrap up in a few minutes. We'll be wrapping up and moving on, but please stay with us. And then Paul, I'd like maybe particularly if I could put you on the spot a little bit. We think of Brazil as such a unique case, the Lava Jato, but in fact, 12 Latin American countries are also involved in Lava Jato. That's a consequence of at least 3 Brazilian firms paying significant bribes, often involving presidents and chief executives of Latin American countries, something like 12 countries, 73 individuals, and 3 more countries which still have credible evidence of corruption occurring via contracts by Brazilian companies operating in those Latin American countries. So I guess, is it just a matter, Paul, looking at the rest of Latin America, which you do so carefully, just a matter of scale? What seems to happen, Brazil is much bigger and has caused all this attention to be drawn, but in fact, despite political regimes being different, geographies being different, natural resource endowments different, the Latin American countries are all struggling with this same issues and all face very serious compliance challenges. Is that fair to say?
No, it is fair to say. And what's interesting about, so we have two data sources to look at on that reveal that indeed the entire region has these sorts of issues at different degrees. One is your typical perceptions-based indices like the World Bank's or Transparency International, which I think are useful. especially if used appropriately. And they do tell us that corruption is a significant problem in the entire region, again, at varying levels. And this particular scandal, the Petrobras one, thanks to how much was apparently paid in each country in exchange for contracts. And what's interesting, and people are starting to look at it, but have not yet looked at it, have not completed studies, is how much per bribe dollar was gained in contracts. And that might speak to, so if a contract is cheaper with regards to how much in bribes has to be paid, that might speak to a more lax compliance regime. Might be so that where there's a stronger compliance regime, you might have fewer contracts that are given out in this way, but when they are given, they're given a higher bribe rate. I'm not sure. We'll have to study that data more closely. But to your point, Tom, the key thing here is that yes, several Latin American countries have been embroiled in this corruption scandal. Hopefully, they will follow the Brazilian example, in my mind, and also prosecuting aggressively and showing that the rules of the game should not be followed in this way. We have cases around the world like Singapore, Hong Kong. Merritt was talking about how the U.S. also reformed. So there are success cases where once they took corruption seriously and confronted it, there was a change in equilibrium.
Thank you very, very much, Paul. And Merritt, in a little while, let you enjoy your morning coffee. But now, without my sincere thanks and pride in be able to present you here to our audience in São Paulo. So thank you again, Merritt, and thank you, Paul. And you're welcome to stay with us as we turn a man known for his ability to be concise and to the point, and as well as uniquely insightful, Marcos Troyjo. If you could sort of draw the lessons for our first panel this morning. So welcome, Marcos. I'll let you close the session.
Thank you very much, Tom, and good morning, Merritt and Paul. I will comply with the short comment. But just basically to say, Tom, on this broader issue of Brazil's image abroad and how it's been impacted by Lava Jato and everything else. I was remembering that earlier in the year at a social gathering in New York, we were accompanied by journalist Charlie Rose, who I think has one of the best TV shows in the world. And when it was a group of Brazilians, he turned to us, and in light of everything that's happening, he asked, when is Brazil going to rise again? When is Brazil going to be back on its feet again? And as he did so, he was telling us of the 7-8 years ago when he was hosting Ike Batista in his show, and The Economist magazine featured at its cover page the statue of Christ the Redeemer blasting off from the Corcovado mountain towards the constellation of great powers. And Charlie Rose was also telling us that, listen, you Brazilians are running out of soft power tools, because you had the narrative of the social inclusion during the Lula years. You had the narrative of being a member of the BRICS set of emerging nations in the world. You're running out of examples, good examples to show, good role models. But then there is Lava Jato, and there's this wave of change, institutional change, that I think is being brought about by Lava Jato. And it's funny that sometimes when I talk to my Latin American colleagues, they say, I wished that, which is happening in Brazil right now, we could also observe in our domestic jurisdictions here. So it's really interesting how, not only in terms of the midterm bonuses that probably those who place their bets on Brazil right now will be able to yield in the near future because of further compliance, better relations with investors, and everything else. But Lava Jato is actually a very good soft power tool for Brazil at present. It's one thing that may not only make it easier for Brazil's image to be enhanced in the eyes of investors, but I think of Brazil's standing in international affairs itself. So thank you.